We have a document that shows over 200 connections between a presidential campaign and a foreign adversary, sharing information that would be illegal if you did it with a super PAC. We know that. But
what information was shared?
Polling data was shared, sir. It's in the report. I can cite you the page.
With who?
You accepted the report as the evidence?
Yes.
You did not question or look at the underlying evidence that supports the conclusions in the report?
No.
Joining us now, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Mr. Chairman, it's good to have you with us this morning. You called after that hearing yesterday for the resignation of the Attorney General. He's not going to do that. I think we can agree. But what did you see in that room that made you call for that resignation?
Well, frankly, what I saw even before the hearing prompted me to call for his resignation, and that is that he testified falsely before Congress. After misleading the American people about what was in the Mueller report, effectively acting as a PR spokesperson for the president instead of the top law enforcement officer in the country, he was asked a direct question about Charlie Crist. He understood exactly what Representative Crist was asking him, and he testified falsely, deliberately and falsely. How can we have confidence in the top law enforcement officer in the land who does that? But if I needed any more reason, I certainly got it during the hearing. And I think you have pointed out this morning the most dangerous thing the Attorney General had to say, and something that makes him every bit as unfit for office as the president, and that is he gave content to his view that the president is above the law. Yeah. If a president under investigation can do away with the investigation because he thinks it's unfair, then no president can be held accountable. Any president can claim that any investigation is unfair. And particularly if you can't look into the president's corrupt motive, if you can't call them to account, if you can't subpoena them to answer questions, then they are effectively above the law. And, you know, I have to say, if that's the view of the Attorney General vis-a-vis the President, is probably the view of the Attorney General as to himself. Could the Attorney General be taken up on perjury charges for lying to Congress? He would probably take the view that he could quash that case because he believed it to be unfair. That is a recipe for lawlessness.
Yeah, the Attorney General saying if the president believes he's falsely accused, he could shut it down. Well, I think most people always believe they're falsely accused but don't have the power to shut it down. Let me ask you just about the top line of the Mueller report, which is that in Volume 1, the special counsel could not establish a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Do you see any reason to challenge that view? Because people come out of that hearing yesterday, people defending the President Trump, many of the Republican senators in that room, and they say the bottom line here is the Attorney General did put out the full report so everyone could see it, and effectively the President is right when he says no collusion, or to be more precise, there was no conspiracy here.
Well, where the President is wrong and where the Attorney General is wrong is when they make the broader claim that there's no evidence of conspiracy. In fact, Bob Mueller, as Senator Feinstein pointed out, makes clear in his very introduction that the fact that he could not establish conspiracy doesn't mean that there wasn't evidence of conspiracy. In fact, there was, and of course the most graphic evidence was around that Trump Tower meeting in New York. What the special counsel concluded was that Don Jr. didn't know the law, and therefore they couldn't prove that he specifically, willfully intended to violate the law. That is a lot less clear with someone like Paul Manafort, who is experienced in running presidential campaigns, right. And it's hard to argue they didn't know better. But I do accept this, that there's a very high burden to prove the elements of the crime of conspiracy. But what we need to look at still, because we don't have any information really about this, and this has the greatest potential to warp the policy of the United States in a pro-Russia direction, or a direction that may not be in our national interest, and that is, what about the counterintelligence investigation into whether the president or people around him were compromised, whether it was criminal or not? And of course, the most graphic illustration of that is Moscow Trump Tower, which is discussed in the report, and the fact that a president sought to make money in the country of a foreign adversary and get the help of the Kremlin to do it while concealing it from the public.
So do you disagree then, Mr. Chairman? Do you disagree with the special counsel? You do see evidence of a conspiracy?
Well, I don't think the special counsel would disagree with the fact there's evidence.
He couldn't establish a conspiracy,
but he couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And, you know, this he also makes clear in the report. The Justice Department policy is not just whether there's evidence of a crime, but can they prove beyond a reasonable doubt? And as I was saying before the report came out, that is really a separate question about whether the president's conduct amounts to collusion as most of the country understands it. I think it does. But rather, can you prove the crime beyond a reasonable doubt? I don't question Mueller's conclusion there. But I do think that we need to expose any evidence of compromise that could still affect the direction of the country.
Congressman, let's get back to Attorney General Barr and his testimony yesterday and his prior testimony on several other occasions before the House and the Senate. Let's stipulate that you are correct in your assessment of the Attorney General's testimony, that he perjured himself, that he was misleading, whatever, and your call for impeachment. Don't you think that the odds are overwhelmingly against the United States Senate voting to convict Attorney General Barr? And therefore, why would you go forward with this? We have so much going on in terms of the helter-skelter nature of the administration, the focus of Congress on trying to get something done. Why would you inject impeachment at this point?
Well, to be clear, I haven't called for the impeachment of the Attorney General. I do think he should step down, but whether we should initiate an impeachment proceeding that we know would be doomed to failure is a different question. I think we need to take the steps now that would lead to potential contempt hearing and vote in the House with respect to not just his failure to appear, but his failure to provide any of the information underlying the Mueller report. He may not think it's important to read the report. Apparently he doesn't. It's staggering that he's not even aware that there's evidence that the Trump campaign's chairman was giving polling data to someone linked to Russian intelligence and discussing the campaign strategy in the Midwestern states. No wonder he doesn't think there's evidence of conspiracy. He apparently hasn't paid attention to the report. So I do think we need to initiate the proceedings that could lead to holding him in contempt. We can do that without a vote in the Senate. We should make the strongest statement that these kind of acts of obstruction of Congress, these declarations that the president is above the law, are contemptuous of the rule of law. And so I think those are steps that we should begin.
Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you very much for being on this morning.
Thank you.
And coming up, we are moments away from Senator Kamala Harris joining us live. We're also following a big development in the family separation story. The Trump administration promised to reunite thousands of separated migrant children and parents at the border last year with the help of a central database. But MSNBC's Jacob Soboroff got access to emails that show those promises to reconnect families were a lie. Jacob joins us with that new reporting ahead.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.